Section number 26 is entitled Factoring the Difference of Squares. Factoring the difference of squares. We're not just factoring any old difference. Here's the difference in what we're factoring. What we're factoring differences of are squares. Namely, one thing squared and another thing squared. Whenever you factor a squared minus b squared, just ask yourself what's being squared. Now put both of them in the brackets 2 times. What's being squared are a and b. That is right, a and b in the first bracket, a and b in the second bracket. Since multiplication commutes, doesn't matter. Okay, one bracket gets a minus and one gets a plus. Since multiplication commutes, you could have put the plus in this first bracket and the minus in the second. Why is that? Because I'm multiplying a plus b and a minus b. The order I do that in doesn't matter. Here I'm multiplying 3 and 4, and here I'm multiplying 3 and 4. Now you should FOIL this out and make sure that I'm not just making this stuff up. And after all, a times a is a squared, and a times negative b is negative ab, and positive b times a is positive b times a, or a times b, and the positive b times the negative b is negative b squared. Now before we go on, I just want to convince you of something. If you're doing a long calculation in your calculator and you get 9, and then you take away 4, and you forgot it was from 9. You did 3 hours of calculation to get 9, and then you took away 4. And you say, oh my, I didn't mean to take away 4, now I have to start from the beginning and spend another 2 hours to get to that number, because you forgot what it was. Of course, if you remembered, you would write down 9 and maybe you meant to multiply by 4. Well, you don't have to start from the beginning. To undo taking away 4, just add it back. That brings you back to 9. Here's my 9. I take away something and then I add it back. That undid, adding it back, undid taking it away. That is, I just have a squared. And then I do what I meant to do, take away b squared, which is exactly what I said on top it would be. A minus b times a plus b is a squared minus b squared. Okay, if you didn't understand much of that, it's not a great loss this time. Now, suppose you have x squared minus 9. Well, so we want to say it's the difference of squares. One thing squared minus another thing squared. Whether you write this down in here or not, you at least have to think it. X squared, well, that's x squared. And 9, well, that's 3 squared. So x and 3 are being squared. I mean, you might be able to look here and say x is being squared and 3 is being squared. And there must be a minus in between. If you can do that, fine. Write down the things that are being squared, namely x and 3, and do it again. X and 3. One gets a minus, one gets a plus. Problem is done. Let us try another one. You have one thing squared minus another thing squared. Write down the 2 things that are being squared in one bracket and then in the second bracket. Put the plus in the middle of one and the minus in the middle of another. You have 9x squared minus 25y squared. This is the difference of squares. Why? Because 3 squared gives you 9 and x squared gives you x squared. Minus. There must be a minus. If it's a plus, you can't factor it. Minus something else squared. Well, 5 squared gives you 25, and y squared gives you y squared. So these two equations are equal. This mess, the beginning problem, is equal to the line beneath it. But now I'm done. I know what's being squared, and there's a minus in between. I write down the two things being squared 2 times in their own brackets. One gets a minus, one gets a plus, and you say that was not bad. But like always, like with every factoring problem, you need to ask yourself, can you factor out anything in common? If I haven't asked it in the last couple of problems, I've been sloppy. I can factor out a 4. So it's 4 times 9, that gives me 36 times x squared, minus the 4 times 4 gives me 16 times y squared. Now, what is inside those brackets is the difference of squares. 9x squared, well, that's 3 squared times x squared. That is, it's 3x all squared, minus. It must be minus. And 2y all squared, that gives me 4y squared. So it is a difference of squares. There's the 4. Now I write down the two things that are being squared twice. One gets a minus, one gets a plus. New next problem. You really need to factor out the minus. In this previous problem, you may say, well, 36 is 6 squared and 16 is 4 squared. So yeah, it definitely is a difference of square problem. And there's a minus in the middle. It's definitely a difference of square problem. But that's not always true. For example, we know that 25x squared, or let's make it 100. Let's use different numbers. We know that 100x squared is 10, squared is 100, and x squared is x squared, so it's 10x all squared minus 49. 49y squared minus 49y squared is 7 squared times y squared. And now, what if the second line was not the original equation? What if it were 200x squared minus 98y squared? I don't want the square root of, nothing squared gives me 200, nothing squared gives me 98, but you factor out the 2. 2 times 100x squared is this, minus, minus, minus. 2 times 98y squared is that. So now we're on a roll. We just have a 2 in the front. Now, this second line in the brackets is the difference of squares. Well, the things that are being squared are 10x and 7y. Brackets, again, one gets a minus, one gets a plus, and there's the answer. And whenever you claim there's the answer, you should look to see if you can factor out anything. In this case, you cannot. Now, here's an interesting problem. I hope I write it down right. In fact, I won't put any numbers in, so I'm pretty sure it'll be right. X to the 4th minus y to the 4th. Now remember, if you have, say, x to the 7th squared, you multiply the powers. Well, I definitely want to have a 2 out there. So I want to square it. I want to say the difference of squares. Again, the difference of squares. Well, 2 times 2 gives me 4, x to the 4th, and here's y squared. Squared. So it's the difference of squares. What's being squared? X squared and y squared. Okay? X squared, y squared. Do it again. X squared, y squared. One gets a minus, one gets a plus. The first term is the sum of squares. One thing squared plus another thing squared. That cannot be factored. But the second term is the difference of squares. The x squared is x squared, and y squared is y squared. So I write down the things being, so I'm not done. I'm not done here. I could factor more. X and y are being squared with a minus in the middle. So I write them down twice. One gets a minus, one gets a plus, and you can't factor this anymore, you can't factor that anymore, and you can't factor the sum of squares anymore. So you're done. Now when I say you can't factor the sum of squares, for example, 4x squared plus 4y squared. 4x squared is 2x all squared plus 4y squared is 2y all squared. That is, this top line is the sum of stuff being squared. But you can factor it. You can factor out. You can factor out the 4. But then you can't factor anymore. Don't even talk about factoring things into, using unusual techniques like the difference of squares, factoring by grouping, or a statement like, oh, you can't factor the sum of squares. First, factor out what's common. In this case, from here, factor out what's common, the 4. And then you say, oh, it's the sum of squares. I can't factor any more. Never talk about any other technique of factoring other than the first thing is, before you talk about any other technique of factoring, you should factor out what's common. Don't, one technique of factoring is two numbers that multiply out to 6 and add up to 5. Before you start doing that, or factoring by grouping, or the difference of squares, or the difference of cubes, which you'll learn one day, before you even get into any of those techniques, factor out what's common. That's the first thing you need to ask yourself. What is common? And on that note, that finishes the section on factoring the difference of squares. There has to be a minus in between, and what's to the left of the minus, you better write down as something squared, and to the right of the minus, you write down that as something squared. Then you write down the two things that are being squared in one bracket, and do it again. One bracket gets a plus, one gets a minus. Next problem.